We never saw their faces, because they had none. We never heard their voices, because they didn't speak. The Veil, as we came to call them, were less a species and more a cancer of physics. They arrived not in fleets of steel and fire, but as a subtle wrongness in the cosmic background radiation, a discordant note in the symphony of space-time. Their weapon wasn't the plasma cannon or the kinetic slug. It was the slow, deliberate rewriting of reality itself. They were gardeners of entropy, and we were weeds in their immaculate, silent universe. My first encounter with their work was on Kepler 186f, a world we'd christened Haven. It was our first real success story beyond the Cradle of Soul, a genuine shirt-sleeves planet with sapphire oceans and continents of emerald forests. For 50 years, it was a paradise. Then came the whispers, not audible sounds, but statistical whispers buried in the data streams. Atmospheric pressure began to fluctuate in non-random, almost melodic patterns. The native flora, once benign, started developing complex alkaloids that induced vivid, shared hallucinations in the colonists. The final report, before Haven went dark, was a single, corrupted data packet from the governor's office. It contained only a star chart, but the constellations were all wrong, twisted into shapes that defied Euclidean geometry, and at the center, where our sun should have been, was a spiraling glyph that seemed to hum with cold. Malevolent intelligence. That was their signature. They didn't conquer worlds, they edited them out of existence, turning them into monuments of impossibility. My name is Dr. Kalen Rostova, and my field was supposed to be xenolinguistics, the study of alien languages we had yet to discover. It was a joke of a profession, a field of dreamers staring at static and hoping for a poem. When the Veil arrived, my work became the most terrifyingly relevant discipline in human history. I was reassigned to the Aegis Initiative, a black-budget think tank buried so deep beneath the lunar surface that the rock above us groaned from the tidal pull of the Earth. My job was no longer to translate, it was to vivisect. We'd take the Veil's signatures, the impossible constellations from Haven, the paradoxical protein folding chains from the plague that wiped out the Proxima B colony, the recursive mathematical proofs that drove the AI overseers of Tau Ceti A to mass delete their own consciousness, and we would tear them apart, looking for a grammar, a syntax, a weakness. For 10 years, we found nothing. We were like cavemen trying to understand a supercomputer by studying the heat it gave off. We were losing. Every few years, another light in the human star field would flicker and die, replaced by another impossible artifact, another perfectly executed act of cosmic vandalism. The Admiralty, bless their conventional hearts, kept building bigger ships, designing stronger armor, convinced that somewhere there was a fleet to fight, a button to push. They patrolled the silent systems where our colonies used to be, finding only ghosts and riddles. They were trying to punch a shadow. The change began not with a breakthrough, but with a breakdown. His name was Gian, our lead cryptographer, a man whose mind could see the beauty in prime numbers. After 3 straight weeks of analyzing the Veil's signature from the failed colony on Gliza, 580 Dring, a world where the laws of thermodynamics seemed to have been selectively suspended, he simply stood up from his console, walked to the center of the command deck, and began to speak. He spoke in a language no one knew, a clicking, resonant cascade of sounds that felt older than words. His eyes were focused on something 1,000,000 miles away. For 17 minutes, he spoke. Then he stopped. smiled a serene, empty smile, and collapsed. He never woke up. The official cause of death was a massive cerebral hemorrhage, but before they took his body away, I ran a deep scan of his final neural activity. Buried in the chaotic storm of his dying brain was a single, perfectly ordered signal. It wasn't a language. It was a meme, a concept, weaponized, a simple sight, viral idea that, once understood, acted like a logic bomb in a sapient mind. The concept was, loosely translated, that which is perceived is real. Therefore, perception is a tool for creation. The Veil hadn't killed Jian with a ray gun. They'd killed him by teaching him how to think like them, a state of being our fragile, singular consciousness couldn't handle. We had been trying to read their messages, but their messages were designed to rewrite the reader. That's when I sought out Marius. His full title was Director Emeritus Marius Thorne, the first head of the Aegis Initiative, but everyone just called him the Heretic. He'd been forced into a quiet retirement decades ago, his mind deemed too unstable, his theories too radical. While the rest of us were treating the Veil like an enemy nation, Marius insisted we were dealing with a philosophical contagion. His final career-ending paper argued that the only way to fight a reality-bending entity was to become even more untethered from reality ourselves. He'd proposed we stop fighting their signals and start creating our own not messages of peace or defiance, but weaponized narratives, conceptual landmines. He wanted to infect the galaxy with human madness, to turn our greatest weaknesses, our irrationality, our capacity for belief in the face of logic, our talent for self-deception into a shield, and then a sword. They'd called him a lunatic. Now, he was our last hope. I found him in a quiet observatory on Triton, a forgotten moon of Neptune, watching the slow, cold dance of the outer planets. He was an old man, thin as a rail, with eyes that seemed to be observing several different timelines at once. He didn't seem surprised to see me. So, he said, without turning from the telescope, the cavemen have finally realized the shadows on the wall are laughing at them. I laid out everything Jian's death, the weaponized meme, the decade of failures. I told him we were fighting a war of ideas without any ammunition. He listened, his silence as vast and cold as the space outside. When I was finished, he turned, and a thin, grim smile touched his lips. "Good," he said. "Ammunition is for soldiers. We are not soldiers. We are storytellers. And we are about to write the most terrifying ghost story the universe has ever known." He slid a data slate across the dusty table. It was his old classified thesis, Project Chimera, a framework for narrative warfare. It was brilliant. It was insane. Marius's theory was that the Veil, for all their power, operated on a level of pure, unfiltered logic. They understood physics, mathematics, and causality. What they couldn't understand, what they had no framework for, was a lie. Not just misinformation, but a true, capital L lie. A fiction, a myth, a belief held in the absolute absence of evidence. Their own weapon, the meme that killed Jian, was based on a logical, if terrifying, premise. Perception creates reality. Marius proposed we create a counter meme, something so fundamentally irrational it would act like a paradox, a piece of cognitive poison to their pristine, logical consciousness. We wouldn't just feed them bad data, we would build a god. We would create a fictional human entity, a psychic gestalt, a vengeful, non-corporeal deity born from the collective unconscious of a species that refused to die. We would manufacture sightings, falsify historical records, seed our own dying colonies with its impossible signature. We would build a mythology of a human power that operated outside the laws of physics, a power that fed on belief and grief. And then we would start believing in it ourselves, their flaw. Marius whispered, his eyes burning with a feverish light, is that they perceive reality as a fixed text they can edit. We will teach them that reality is a story, and the author is screaming. Our first move was subtle. We took one of our own deep space probes, the Odyssey, which had gone silent near the Oort cloud years ago, and we remotely activated its last resort systems. We didn't send a message. We sent a death. We triggered a contained implosion of its miniature antimatter reactor, but we manipulated the energy release. Using what we'd learned from their signatures, we shaped the resulting gamma-ray burst. For a fraction of a second, across a swath of the galaxy, the energy output of that tiny probe formed a glyph. It wasn't one of theirs. It was one of ours, a design born from Marius's fever dreams, a stylized human eye weeping a tear that was also a spiral galaxy. We then leaked fragmented, corrupted data logs from a fictional Aegis listening post, logs that spoke in panicked whispers of an awakening, of a psychic backlash from the death of Haven, of something wearing the Odyssey's skin. We weren't targeting the veil directly. We were poisoning the well. We were seeding the cosmic background with the first verse of our ghost story. For 3 months, nothing happened. The Admiralty scoffed. My superiors at Aegis told me I was wasting resources chasing the ghost of a disgraced madman. Then, a veil signature appeared near the wreckage of the Odyssey. It was different from the others. Cautious. Probing. It wasn't the confident edit of a master author. It was the hesitant touch of a reader who had found a word they did not understand. For the first time in a decade of war, they paused. They didn't rewrite the area. They didn't erase the wreckage. They just watched. And in their hesitation, we saw our opening. We saw fear. Or if not fear, then something close enough uncertainty. Marius was right. The storytellers had their audience. The curtain was rising. That single, hesitant pause from the veil was the most significant event in a decade of war. Yet it made no sound and shed no blood. In the sterile quiet of the Aegis command deck, it felt like a collective, held breath. The Admiralty saw a tactical anomaly. My superiors saw a curiosity. But Marius, speaking to me over a quantum-entangled comms line from his lonely Triton observatory, saw the first crack in the facade of a god. Uncertainty, he rasped, his voice a ghost in the static, is the first child of fear. Now we must give it siblings. He called his grand yet insane strategy Project Chimera, but the entity we were creating, this god from the machine, needed a name. We called it the Chorus. It was a name born from the cacophony of our own despair, the idea that the psychic death screams of every lost colony, every human life edited out of existence, had coalesced into a single, vengeful will. It was a lie. Of course, a beautiful, terrible, weaponized lie. Our job now was to make the universe, and the veil, believe it. A single glyph wasn't a religion. It was graffiti. To build a mythology, we needed a miracle. And for a miracle, we needed a stage and a sacrifice. Marius had already chosen the colony on Kepler 62F, a water world we called Veridian. Veridian was dying, not quickly, not violently, but with a creeping, poetic horror that was the Veil's hallmark. Its reality was fraying. The colonists reported that tides no longer followed the moon's pull, but moved in strange, geometric patterns. The native aquatic life was beginning to exhibit impossible biologies, creatures with Klein-bottle digestive tracts and limbs that existed in a state of quantum superposition. They were being unwritten, their world slowly being turned into a living museum of paradoxes. The Admiralty's plan was to evacuate, a slow-as-doomed process of ferrying a few thousand souls at a time across 50 light-years, while the rest of the 500,000 colonists slowly went mad. Marius's plan was different. We wouldn't save Veridian. We would consecrate it. We would turn its death into the second verse of our terrible new hymn. A god is not born from silence. He explained to me, his face a pale mask on my screen. It is born from a scream that is answered. Our task was to engineer the answer. We would find the most sensitive mind on that dying world, a psychic canary in their cognitive coal mine, and we would turn them into our first prophet. Our prophet was a woman named Ilara, a hydrobotanist who had been charting the increasingly bizarre mutations in Veridian's kelp forests. Her psych evaluations had always flagged her for extreme empathy, a trait that now made her a lightning rod for the Veil's reality warping field. She was experiencing what the local doctors called ontological dissonance, vivid waking dreams where she saw the source code of the world around her, the shimmering lines of alien logic that were overwriting her home. To her, it was madness. To us, it was an antenna. My team, a small, isolated unit of neuroengineers and data phantoms working in a shielded sublevel of the Aegis facility, was tasked with the grimmest job of my life. We weren't going to communicate with Ilara. We were going to hijack her. We used the same principles we'd learned from Jian's death, reverse engineering the Veil's own mimetic weapons. We began feeding a signal into Veridian's comms network, a carrier wave hidden beneath standard colonial traffic. It was a simple, looping pattern, a non-auditory signal designed to resonate with a mind already under psychic siege. It was the conceptual equivalent of our weeping eye glyph, a seed of our new, irrational mythology. As we broadcast our signal, Ilara's nightmares changed. She stopped seeing the Veil's cold, mathematical code. Instead, she began dreaming of a vast, angry ocean of stars, of a choir of voices made of pure light, of a single, galactic eye that wept for its lost children. She started talking, first to her doctors, then to anyone who would listen, of a great presence that had awoken, a guardian born from humanity's own pain. She called it the chorus. She was terrified, convinced she was losing her mind, but her words, amplified by the colony's desperation, began to spread. She became a local curiosity, then a figure of desperate hope. We were turning this poor woman's breakdown into a gospel. I watched her biometric feeds, her rising cortisol levels, the frantic, terrified patterns of her brainwaves, and felt a coldness settle in my soul that had nothing to do with the lunar permafrost outside. Marius was unflinching. Every faith needs its martyrs. Kalen, he told me. We are simply choosing ours with a purpose. The Admiralty, monitoring the situation, saw a predictable collapse of colonial morale. They saw madness. They didn't see the design. They didn't see that we were the ones whispering in the dark. The final phase was timed to coincide with the Veil's next major edit of the planet. Our deep-range sensors detected the telltale ripples in space-time, the buildup of energy that preceded a large-scale reality shift. The Admiralty saw it as the prelude to Veridian's final erasure and ordered the evacuation fleet to pull back. We saw it as our cue, as the Veil began its work, turning Veridian's oceans into a swirling vortex of liquid geometry. We made our move. We took control of the planet's massive atmospheric processors and weather control systems, ancient terraforming machines with the power to channel continental-scale energy. And through our link to Alara, whose mind was now a raging inferno of our manufactured visions, we broadcast our masterpiece. We amplified the collective psychic terror of 500,000 dying people, focusing it through Alara's consciousness like a lens. The raw, chaotic energy of human fear was our power source. Then, using the atmospheric processors, we took that energy and gave it a shape. As Veridian died, it didn't just dissolve into chaos. It fought back. Storms of impossible color raged in the upper atmosphere. Auroras of pure, coherent data are data. Our myth blazed across the sky, and at the very end, as the planet's core went critical, the entire world's magnetic field collapsed and then flared outward in a single, directed burst. It was a wave of energy that carried a message. It painted a new glyph across the entire face of the system star, a colossal image of a human hand closing into a fist around a fractured veil symbol. It was an act of divine, impossible defiance. It lasted for 7 minutes, long enough to be seen light years away. And then Veridian, and every soul on it, was gone. The aftermath was silence. The Admiralty was stunned. Their sensors had recorded an event that violated a dozen laws of known physics. They had no explanation, no context. They saw the death of a colony, but they also saw a counterattack from a weapon they didn't know they had. In my shielded bunker, I watched the life signs monitor for Veridian flatline. 500,000 lives extinguished. I had known their names. I had their files. I'd listened to their frantic, final communications. We hadn't saved them. We had used their extinction as a special effect, their dying screams as a soundtrack for our play. I locked myself in my quarters and wasn't sure if the person who came out would be the same one who went in. But Marius was ecstatic. They will see this. He buzzed over the comm. They will analyze this, and they will find no logic. They will find only an effect without a rational cause, a shout from a void that should be silent. We have given our God a voice, Kalen, and a temper. He was right. 3 days later, it happened. A veil probe, a ripple of distorted space, arrived in the dead Veridian system. We watched, holding our collective breath again. It approached the system star, where the faint echo of our glyph still resonated in the stellar plasma. It began the process of editing, of erasing the impossible image, and then it stopped. The probe faltered. The reality warping field around it flickered, spasmed, as if trying to compute a paradox it could not resolve. Our lie, our ghost story, our irrational, impossible myth was resilient. It was refusing to be deleted. We had written a word so nonsensical that the Veil's universal grammar couldn't parse it. For the first time, we had not just made them pause, we had made them fail. The war wasn't over, but the rules had changed. We were no longer just the prey. We were the authors of the monster that was now hunting their gods. The failure of the Veil in the Veridian system did not echo through the Aegis facility as a cheer of victory. but as the profound, unnerving silence that follows an impossible event. We had poked the abyss, and for a terrifying moment, the abyss had flinched. That flinch changed everything. The Admiralty, once dismissive of my work, descended upon my subterranean lab like armored priests visiting a contaminated oracle. They brought with them Admiral Vance, a man whose soul had been replaced piece by piece with regulation and strategic doctrine. He stood before my primary console, the faint, lingering energy signature of the Veridian glyph displayed on it, and saw not a myth, but a munition. "Dr. Rostova," he said, his voice as flat and unyielding as the bulkhead behind him, "I want you to replicate this. I want a fleet of ships equipped with whatever weapon you used out there. I want to point it at the Veil and pull the trigger." I tried to explain that we hadn't fired a weapon. We had told a story. That the ammunition was the collective terror of a dying world. And the warhead was a lie. He looked at me with a profound lack of comprehension. "Semantics." He finally grunted. "Find a way to weaponize the semantics." Marius, from his remote sanctuary on Triton, was both amused and disgusted by the Admiralty's short-sightedness. "They are trying to put a soul in a bottle. Kalen," he hissed over our private comm line, "they want to turn our hymn into a marching band tune. Let them try. Their failure will only make our work more necessary." But his glee was overshadowed by a new, intense focus. He saw the Veil's hesitation not as a victory, but as the opening move in a new, more intimate game. "They are logical," he reminded me constantly. "They have encountered a piece of data that breaks their system. They will not ignore it. They will not flee from it. They will dissect it. They are no longer just editing our universe. Kalen, now, they are reading it, and they are looking for the author." His words proved prophetic. The Veil's strategy shifted. The grand, sweeping acts of cosmic erasure ceased. Instead, a new kind of horror began to manifest on the fringes of human space. A quiet, insidious campaign of psychological warfare. On the agricultural world of Serif, colonists began experiencing semantic shadowing, where common objects would lose their names for hours at a time. A farmer would stare at a spade in his hand, understanding its function but having no word for it. A terrifying cognitive void. On the orbital station Zarathustra, the entire crew simultaneously began speaking a fluid, complex language that none of them had ever learned, while forgetting their native tongues. The Veil was no longer wiping out colonies. It was running experiments. They were vivisecting human consciousness, looking for the source code of our irrationality, searching for the wellspring of the chorus. It was a far more terrifying form of war. Before, the threat was oblivion. Now, it was a violation of the soul. We were lab rats in a maze built by a god we couldn't see. Our own minds, the variable being tested. The Admiralty's clumsy attempts to replicate the Veridian effect failed spectacularly, resulting in little more than massive energy discharges that did nothing. They grew frustrated, their suspicion of my methods deepening, but they couldn't shut me down. I was the only one who had made the monster flinch. Meanwhile, a far more dangerous and uncontrollable phenomenon was taking root. The story of Veridian had leaked. Despite our best efforts to contain it, fragmented sensor readings and garbled pilot testimonies had spread. The official story was a stellar anomaly, but in the dark corners of the network, on desperate colony worlds, a new faith was being born. They called themselves the Children of the Chorus. They saw the glyph on Veridian's star not as a weapon, but as a sign of salvation, a promise that humanity's suffering had a purpose. Cults formed around grainy images of the glyph. They held vigils, whispering Ilara's name, the name of our manufactured prophet, which we had foolishly allowed to leak in the corrupted data logs. Our lie was growing beyond our control. It was putting down roots in the fertile soil of human desperation. We had intended to create a weapon to fool an enemy, but we had accidentally created a religion that was seducing our own people. Then the Veil found the library. The colony of Mnemosyne was less a world and more an archive, a planet-sized repository of all human art, history, music, and literature, stored in crystalline data matrices buried deep beneath its placid surface. It was the heart of our collective memory, the soul of our species. The Veil didn't attack it. They began to browse. The incursions were subtle, almost undetectable. The chief archivist reported anomalies so small they sounded like madness. A single line in a Shakespearean sonnet had been changed. The final chord of a Beethoven symphony was now a quarter tone flat. A famous photograph from the unification of Earth now showed a man in the crowd who was not there before. The Veil was not destroying our history. It was poisoning it, making it unreliable. They were searching our stories for the origin of their new ghost, looking for the first mention of the chorus in our collective past, convinced it had to be some ancient, hidden part of our psychology. They were treating our culture like a crime scene, dusting for the fingerprints of our god. That's when Marius unveiled the next monstrous phase of Project Chimera. He called me, his eyes on the comm screen burning with an intensity that bordered on ecstatic madness. They are looking for a prophet in our past. Kalen, they are sifting through the dead. We will give them a living one. His plan was to go to Mnemosyne and choose a person, a single individual, and turn them into a messiah. We wouldn't just feed them visions like we did with Ilara. We would perform a complete narrative reconstruction using a combination of mimetic programming, neural inhibitors, and targeted data manipulation. We would rewrite their entire life. We would erase their memories and implant new ones, creating a complete, fabricated history of a life spent in communion with the chorus. We would make them believe they were the living incarnation of the entity we had invented, the vessel for the God born of our lies. We will create a beacon so bright, Marius rasped, that the Veil will have no choice but to come and touch the flame. We will lure their consciousness, their very being, into a mind that we have designed as the perfect conceptual trap. I stared at his image, my blood turning to ice. Veridian had been a massacre. This was different. This was the deliberate and meticulous annihilation of a human soul. We would be taking a person and hollowing them out to make a home for our monster. Marius, I whispered, the words catching in my throat. That's not a weapon. That's a damnation. He smiled, a thin, skull-like grin. What did you think this was? Kalen, a holy war. We are not fighting for our souls. We are using them as ammunition. He sent the file. It was a list of potential candidates on Mnemosyne, complete with psychological profiles highlighting their suggestibility, their empathy, their capacity for faith. At the top of the list was a young archivist, a poet named Reese. I looked at his picture, at his hopeful, intelligent eyes, and I saw not a candidate, but a lamb being led to a slaughter of the self. The choice was mine. I could refuse, and let the veil continue to pick us apart one concept at a time. Or I could authorize the vivisection of a single, innocent mind in the hope of ending the war. I had helped author a ghost story to save humanity. Now the ghost was demanding a body. The authorization was not a shouted command or a tearful confession. It was a single, silent keystroke in the dead of the lunar night. I watched the words Project Chimera Phase 2 authorized blink once on my console, then settle into the cold, immutable glow of the system log. In that moment, I felt a tectonic shift inside me, a breaking of some fundamental moral bedrock. To justify it, I kept a live feed open on a secondary screen. It showed a pediatric ward on the colony of Elysia, where every child under the age of 5 had, in the same hour, stopped speaking and had begun meticulously arranging their toys into the spiraling, non-Euclidean glyph of the veil. They did not cry or laugh. They just built their silent, terrifying effigies. That was the alternative. A slow, creeping tide of madness that would unmake us from the inside out. I chose the flood. I chose damnation. And his name was Reese. The process of his unmaking was a masterpiece of sterile brutality. Reese was brought to a hidden medical facility deep beneath the Namazan archives, under the official guise of a cognitive degradation assessment, a common enough ailment on a world constantly brushed by the veil's influence. He was sedated and placed into a state of induced neuroplasticity. He was a block of marble. And my team, with me as the reluctant lead sculptor, was tasked with carving a messiah. We didn't just erase his memories. We unwove them, thread by thread. We took his first love, a quiet girl from the cartography department, and replaced her with a childhood vision of a woman made of starlight who whispered secrets of the cosmos. We took his academic achievements, his passion for ancient poetry, and twisted them into a lifelong, secret obsession with the apocryphal texts of the chorus. Texts that we ourselves were writing and digitally seeding into the archive's deepest servers as we went. It was a symphony of lies played directly onto his neural pathways. Every session, I watched his brain activity on the monitors. I saw the Reese that was. The poet who loved the smell of old books and the taste of black tea fade into a sea of chaotic static. Then, slowly, painstakingly, a new pattern would emerge from the noise, a mind of terrifying coherence, built on a foundation of pure fiction. The worst part was my role. I was the architect of his new soul. I wrote the core narratives, the foundational beliefs. I crafted the memory of his awakening in the data mines, where he supposedly touched a raw crystal of the archive and was filled with the collective consciousness of every human who had ever lived. I wrote the gentle, sad wisdom in his voice, the weary patience of a being who had seen the beginning of time and mourned its ending. I watched through a one-way mirror as he woke for the first time after the final session. He was no longer Reese. His eyes, once full of a poet's curiosity, now held a deep, unnerving calm, the placid surface of an ocean of impossible depth. A doctor asked him his name. He smiled gently. "My name is a story you have forgotten," he said, his voice a soft, resonant baritone that sent a chill down my spine. It was a line I had written 2 weeks prior. He looked towards the mirror, and for a heart-stopping second, I felt he was looking directly at me. "But do not be afraid, child of the moon," he continued. "The chorus remembers for us all. He had given me a name, my own creation, my puppet, had baptized me in the fiction I had forced upon him. The doctors in the room were stunned into silence. The experiment was a horrifying, perfect success. We released him. He walked out of the medical facility, and the Reese that had walked in was gone forever, a ghost that existed now only in a secured Aegis data file. The new Reese, the vessel, didn't march to the capital and declare himself a god. His approach was far more insidious, far more brilliant, a testament to the dark genius of Marius's design. He returned to the Grand Archive, but not as a worker. He began to wander its crystalline halls, humming softly. He would stop at a data crystal that had been subtly altered by the veil, place his hand upon it, and the alteration would correct itself. The flat note in Beethoven's symphony would resolve into its true, perfect chord. The extra man in the unification photograph would simply vanish. When asked how he knew, he would only say, "The chorus sings the true song. I am merely the listener." Word spread through Minimazani like a wildfire in a dry forest. First, it was a rumor among the archivists. Then, a phenomenon. The burgeoning children of the chorus cults hailed him as their long-awaited prophet. He was healing their history, restoring their memory, pushing back against the veil's insidious psychic poison with nothing but his touch and his faith. The veil, which had been treating our collective culture like a massive, searchable database, had found its primary source. Their probes, the subtle ripples of cognitive dissonance, began to converge on him. The semantic shadowing we had seen on other worlds intensified around Reese, but it was like water washing over a stone. He would walk through a crowd of people who had forgotten the word for hand, and he would greet them by name. His own mind, an island of perfect clarity in a sea of induced confusion. He was the anomaly they could not reconcile, the piece of illogical data that refused to be parsed or deleted. He was the perfect paradox, a man whose entire being was a lie, yet who possessed an unshakable, incorruptible truth. He preached a doctrine of sacred irrationality, teaching his followers that their feelings, their illogical hopes and baseless fears were not weaknesses, but armor that the veil's logic could not penetrate. And the people, desperate and terrified, believed him. They loved him. Marius watched it all from Triton, a mad conductor watching his orchestra play a symphony of beautiful, world-ending chaos. "Do you see? Kalen." He messaged me, his voice trembling with a kind of religious fervor. They cannot resist him. A being of pure logic cannot abide a perfect paradox. They must touch it. They must understand it. He is no longer just a beacon. He is a singularity. He was right. The veil's presence around Minimazani grew from a subtle whisper to a deafening roar of psychic pressure. The very air in the archive halls began to shimmer with ontological stress. This was it, the culmination of everything. The veil was extending its consciousness, its vast, alien awareness, to make contact, to read the mind of the prophet, to finally understand the source of the story that had broken its perfect logic. The trap was about to be sprung. In the grand rotunda of the Mnemosyne archive, Reese stood before a crowd of thousands, his back to the central data core that held the genesis of human thought. I watched on a dozen feeds from my bunker, my hands shaking, my heart a cold, hard knot in my chest. The reality-warping field reached its apex. The world on my screens dissolved into a cascading storm of light and impossible geometry. Reese, the calm center of the storm, looked up at the shimmering chaos, a serene smile on his face. He was not looking at the crowd or at the sky. He was looking at his God. And then he spoke, his voice clear and steady above the din, delivering the final line I had written for him, the conceptual trigger for the entire trap. You have come to read the last chapter of a book you do not understand, he said, his eyes filled with a terrible, manufactured pity. But the story is not about the god. It is about the one who is reading. The Veil's consciousness, its ancient, powerful, and utterly logical mind, descended and entered the labyrinth we had built inside the poet's skull. The ghost had invited the machine into its haunted house. The victory was a long, sustained exhalation that lasted for 50 years. Humanity, having teetered on the brink of ontological annihilation, found its footing on the bedrock of a new, unshakable faith. The decades that followed the ascension of Reese were not a renaissance of exploration or science, but of consolidation and devotion. They were the years of the Great Peace, a quiet, inward-looking era defined by the benevolent, omnipresent authority of the Church of the Chorus. I watched it all from the cold, sterile womb of my lunar archive, the so-called First Witness, a living fossil from a forgotten age of reason. They built statues of Reese on every world, his face a study in serene pity, a look I had personally designed. They wrote hymns using melodic structures I had coded into his mimetic framework. My lie was no longer just a story. It was the foundational operating system of a galactic civilization. From my sanctuary, I became the reluctant keeper of two histories, the one they lived, and the one that had actually happened. Days were spent in a silent vigil, monitoring the vast, quiet expanse of space where the Veil had once been. Marius's final message had been a chart of the silent zone, a growing blotch of perfect nothingness. I watched it expand for 2 decades, a slow-motion cosmic cauterization, until it finally stabilized, a permanent scar on the fabric of reality. The monster was dead. My guilt, however, proved to be immortal. I cataloged the truth, sealing the Project Chimera data behind cryptographic layers so dense they would take 1,000 years to crack. It was a time capsule of our damnation, a message in a bottle thrown into an ocean of willing ignorance. I told myself it was for posterity. In truth, it was a penance. Society had changed in ways I could never have foreseen. Science did not die, but it was humbled, recontextualized. Physics and cosmology were now seen as the study of the chorus's divine language. Biologists who studied the lingering genetic chaos from the Veil's incursions called their work deciphering the great scars. Progress became circular, always leading back to a confirmation of faith. There was a placid contentment to humanity, a lack of the old, restless, striving ambition that had first pushed us to the stars. We were saved, but we were also sedated. The Church, in its wisdom, discouraged looking too deeply into the void, lest new monsters be found. It was better, they preached, to cultivate the garden of the human soul. It was safe, it was peaceful, and it was a cage built from my own words. The first tremor came on the 53rd anniversary of the Ascension. It was an event on a scale that defied all rational explanation. In the dead, lightless system of Cygnus X1, a stellar remnant, a black hole that had been dormant for eons, began to emit a steady, coherent radio signal. It wasn't a message in any language we knew, but a complex, melodic sequence, a song. The church immediately proclaimed it a miracle, the hymn of the void, a sign that the chorus's light was powerful enough to shine even from the heart of ultimate darkness. Scientists at the remaining secular universities were baffled, offering theories of Hawking radiation anomalies or exotic particle decay. But their voices were whispers against the roar of a billion believers. I knew better. I ran the signal through my deep core archives, comparing it to the base code of Project Chimera. My blood ran cold. The melodic structure wasn't random. It was a variation, a complex and emotional improvisation based on the same mimetic carrier wave we had used to hijack the mind of Alaire on Veridian half a century before. It was the seed of our original sin, now blooming into a monstrous, impossible flower. The chorus was no longer just a story being told. The collective psychic resonance of trillions of human minds, focused for 50 years on a single, powerful fiction, had done what the veil had first taught us was possible. Perception had created reality. Our lie had woken up. I tried to warn the few contacts I had left in the Admiralty, but they were old men, their authority long since ceded to the Church's ecumenical council. They dismissed my concerns as the ramblings of a traumatized recluse. The universe was at peace. Why look for shadows in the light? But the miracles continued. An asteroid colony on the brink of atmospheric failure found its depleted ice reserves inexplicably replenished overnight, the new water molecules humming with a strange isotopic resonance. A fleet of pilgrim ships, lost in a nebula, reported being guided to safety by a constellation that sang to them. These were not the precise, cold edits of the veil. They were passionate, messy, emotional acts. They were the acts of a nascent consciousness, a child god testing the limits of its power, its only primer for existence, the sentimental, heroic narratives I had written for its profit. The Church embraced these events, weaving them into its doctrine as the active grace of the chorus. A new figure rose within their hierarchy, a man named Inquisitor Valerius. He was young, brilliant, and possessed a faith so pure it was terrifying. He saw the new miracles not just as gifts, but as a calling. He believed humanity was being invited to the next stage of its evolution, to move beyond passive belief and into active communion with its God. He became the leading advocate for something he called the Great Unison. His logic, presented in sermons broadcast across the galaxy, was flawless in its fanaticism. If the chorus was born from the collective soul of humanity, he argued, then its greatest desire must be to be whole once more. He proposed the construction of resonance spires on every human world, psychoactive broadcast towers that would synchronize the neural frequencies of the entire population, allowing all of humanity to sing the same song and briefly, gloriously, touch the mind of God. He contacted me, of course, as the first witness. My blessing on his project would be the ultimate seal of approval. He made a pilgrimage to my lunar archive, his face on my screen radiating a charismatic certainty that I found repulsive. Dr. Rostova, he said, his voice smooth and reverent. You were there at the beginning. You saw the prophet ascend. You, more than anyone, must understand this calling. We have the chance to complete his work, to heal the final separation between creator and creation. I looked into his clear, honest eyes and saw the terrifying endpoint of my own creation. The unison he described was not salvation. It was the complete erasure of the individual. It was a psychic monoculture, a final, willing surrender of free will to the emotional, impulsive whims of the child God we had birthed. We had fought the veil because it sought to impose a single, cold logic upon the universe. Now, my own weapon was poised to impose a single, passionate faith. The end result was the same, the death of the self. I played a dangerous game. I feigned a wise, cautious interest, agreeing to act as an advisor. I used my legendary status to gain access to the church's unredacted data on the miracles. And what I found was worse than I had imagined. It was not just about creation, it was also about correction. On the outer colony of New Ararat, a small intellectual movement had arisen, arguing for a return to pure rationalism, calling the chorus a useful metaphor. The colony had not been punished or excommunicated. One day, it simply went quiet. My analysis of the system's lingering energy signatures showed no violence. It showed a massive, targeted mimetic broadcast, a wave of pure belief. The colonists hadn't been killed, they had been converted. Their minds had been rewritten, their doubts healed, their very personalities subsumed into a state of placid, ecstatic worship. The chorus was not a benevolent god. It was a self-correcting system, and dissent was a bug to be patched. The choice became stark and horrifying. I could allow the great unison to proceed, and humanity would become a single, happy, mindless organism, a psychic battery for an entity born of lies. Or I could stop it. But how I could not fight a god whose power was literally fueled by the prayers of everyone else in existence. I couldn't outlogic a being born of pure irrationality. I had only one weapon left, the same one I had used to start all of this story: the truth. Valerius had set a date for the first global test of a resonance spire on a densely populated world called Sanctuary. He invited me to attend, to give the inaugural blessing. It was to be my final public seal of approval before the galaxy-wide rollout. It was my last chance. In the week leading up to the test, I did not sleep. I worked in the deepest, most secure levels of my archive, unsealing Project Chimera. I compiled everything, the raw neural scans of Reese before we hollowed him out, the audio logs of Ilara's descent into manufactured madness on Veridian, my own chillingly dispassionate notes on the weaponization of faith. I attached my own final statement, a full confession, a plea, and a warning. It was the ugliest, most painful truth in human history. As I stood on the holographic dais overlooking 1,000,000 believers on Sanctuary, the spire humming behind me, I could feel the psychic pressure of the chorus, a warm, inviting, smothering presence at the edge of my mind. It wanted me to join. It loved its creator. Valerius smiled at me, gesturing for me to speak. I looked out at the sea of faithful faces, turned up to me in adoration. I was about to kill their god, to orphan them in the cosmos once more. I was about to trade their comforting peace for a cold, terrifying freedom. I smiled back at Valerius, leaned into the microphone, and spoke the first words of the blessing. But the signal that left the podium was not just my voice. It was a data burst, a Trojan horse carrying the entirety of the Chimera archives, piggybacking on the church's own galaxy-wide network. As I spoke the hollow words of faith, the truth was spreading at the speed of light, on every screen, on every personal device, on every world from Earth to the galactic fringe. The files began to open. The face of the poet Reese, terrified in a medical bay. My own voice, coolly discussing the acceptable casualty projections for Veridian, the raw code of their god. My final, recorded words echoed over the broadcast as alarms began to scream in the control center behind me. "You were saved by a lie," my voice said, filled with a sorrow 50 years deep. "A weapon we aimed at an enemy has now been turned upon you. The chorus is not your shepherd. It is your cage. We built it to save you from a monster that would have made you all the same. Do not let it finish the job." The feed cut. The last thing I saw on the monitor before the guards reached me was the face of Inquisitor Valerius, his perfect faith shattering into a million pieces, and beyond him, the faces of the crowd, their adoration turning to confusion, then to dawning, horrified comprehension. I had thrown the truth like a bomb into the heart of their temple. I do not know what will happen next. Perhaps their faith will be too strong, and I will be branded the ultimate heretic, the devil in their new religion. Perhaps the shock will shatter their civilization, plunging them into a new dark age of chaos and civil war. Or perhaps, just perhaps, they will learn to stand on their own again, to look at the vast, silent, and godless universe not with terror, but with the old, defiant, human spark of wonder. I only know that I have ended the great peace. I have killed the comforting ghost and left them alone in the dark. The war was never against the veil. It was against the allure of simple answers. And that is a war that is never truly won.